Learning outcomes. After studying this model, you shall be able to know the instruments of trade policy used by governments for trade intervention, distinguish between tariff and non-tariff barriers, understand the administrative barriers to trade, understand the role of subsidies in world trade, know about dumping and anti-dumping policies. Free trade. Free trade is a situation where government does not stop its citizens to buy goods and services from abroad or sell goods and services in foreign countries. However, free trade is a rare phenomenon. Governments actually try to control what their citizens can buy or sell abroad through intervention in free trade with instruments of something known as trade policy. The instruments that government use to intervene in trade policy can be broadly classified under the following two heads, namely tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers. Tariff barriers refer to taxes imposed by government on goods that are imported into the country. Tariffs collected by the exporting country are called export tariffs if they are collected by a country through which the goods have passed. They are transit tariffs. Those collected by importing countries are called import tariffs. Since import tariffs are common of all, we discuss import tariffs in detail. Tariff barrier increases the price of imported goods in comparison to domestic goods, which make the imported goods costlier, giving the domestic goods a relative advantage over foreign goods. Thus, they help the domestic government in reducing imports. In case of India, the cheap imports of refined oil have hit the domestic vegetable oil producing industry hard, with capacity utilization of this sector dropping to 30 to 40%. To protect the domestic products, the Indian government levies an import duty of 10% on refined edible oil to protect the domestic processing industry and the farmers. Let us now discuss the types of tariffs. The tariff barriers can further be of three types. The first being specific tariffs. Specific tariffs are levied as fixed charge for each unit of good imported. For example, rupees 10 per unit of good imported. The second one is ad valorem tariff. Ad valorem tariff are levied as percentage of the value of goods imported. For example, 10% of the value of goods. If value of goods is 1000 rupees, the ad valorem tariff would be rupees 100. The third one being the compound tariff. Compound tariffs are assessed as both a specific tariff and an ad valorem tariff on the same. That means an application of rupees 10 plus 10% on the value of goods. Now let us discuss the rationale for imposing tariff. Tariffs help in raising revenue for the domestic government, especially in case of developing countries. They protect domestic producers from foreign competition. This is because it increases the price of foreign goods by restricting the quantity of imports coming into the country. Suppose the price of sugar in domestic market is rupees 60 per kilogram, while the price of imported sugar is rupees 50 per kilogram. In the absence of import tariffs, imported sugar would be cheaper. Consumers would be more inclined to buy the imported sugar. Now let us suppose that the domestic government levy an import tariff of rupees 20 per kilogram. The imported sugar would become costlier, which would be rupees 70, as a result of which there would be demand of domestic sugar, which is still at rupees 60. Next, we will discuss non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers refer to any government regulation, policy or procedure other than a tariff that has the impact of minimizing imports. Non-tariff barriers can be of two types. One, that have direct influence on the price of the good being imported, and the other influences or controls the quantity of goods being imported. Direct price influences. Subsidies. Subsidies are the direct payments made by government to domestic producers. It can take form of cash payments, low interest loans, government participation in ownership, tax incentives, etc. Subsidies helps in lowering down the cost of production of domestic goods, as a result of which the prices also come down. It helps domestic producers to capture export markets by making their products cheaper in international markets. It also helps the domestic producers to compete against the cheaper imported goods in domestic markets. Another consequence of such subsidies is to create surplus production. That surplus is then sold in international market where the extra supply depresses the price, making it much harder for producers in developing world to sell their output at profit. Agriculture is one of the greatest beneficiaries of subsidies in most countries. Many developed nations like Japan, European Union, United States, Canada, and many other countries are giving huge subsidies to their farmers. Outside of agriculture, subsidies are much lower, but they are all still significant. However, the problem with subsidies is that it requires expenditure on part of domestic government. It is because of this reason that developing countries find it difficult to grant subsidies to their producers as compared to their foreign counterparts because of lack of resources. A government might have to choose between imposing a tariff on competing imports or directly subsidize the industry concerned. A tariff would raise the domestic price of imports and the domestic consumers have to pay the higher price. But if a subsidy is used, the domestic prices would still be less and the subsidy received by domestic industry would allow it to compete with foreign goods at competitive prices in global markets. Thus, subsidy become a better choice when the government do not want the consumers to pay more, but at the same time enables its domestic producers to capture global markets. Export subsidies, however, under the World Trade Organization agreement are treated as unfair trade practices. The importing countries counter such subsidies by levying countervailing duties on imported goods so as to offset the impact of these subsidies. This helps in protecting domestic producers from unfair foreign competition. The next one is quality controls. In quality controls, the first one that we will be discussing is quotas. Quota is the most traditional and common method for non-tariff barriers. It refers to the direct restriction on the quantity of goods that can be imported into a country during any period of time. In other words, quotas limit the quantity of imports of any particular commodity coming into a country during a certain period of time. The quotas help the government to reduce the consumption of any particular commodity in the country. This is normally done through giving of import licenses to the importers. For example, the United States has a quota on cheese import. India has a quota on import of gold. Sometimes governments may use tariff rate quotas according to which a certain quantity of goods enter the country duty free or at a low rate. However, there is a very high rate of tariff for subsequent imports. Differences between quota and tariffs. Quota increases the prices of goods just as tariffs do. But while tariff is a source of revenue for the government, quotas do not provide any revenue. In fact, quota generate revenue for those companies which have the license to import the limited quantity of goods by increasing the prices in the absence of any competition. Voluntary export restraints, also known as VERs. VERs are bilateral agreements instituted to restrain the rapid growth of export of specific goods. Essentially, the government of country X asks the government of country Y to reduce its company's exports to country X voluntarily to help the importing country X to protect its domestic industry. One of the most famous examples of voluntary export restraints is the limitation on auto exports to United States enforced by Japanese automobile producers in 1981. The effect of VERs is similar to that of quota, whereby there is an increase in the price of imported goods for consumers because of limited supply of imported goods. In the above example, the VER increased the price of the limited supply of Japanese imports. According to a study by US Federal Trade Commission, which is also known as FTC, the US consumer had to pay $5 billion extra due to this VER. Local content requirement. A local content requirement is a requirement that some fraction of product must be produced locally or in the domestic market. The requirement can either be expressed in physical terms, 60% of the parts of the product, or in value terms, that is 60% of the value of the product. Thus, it ensures that in any company wants a contract from the government agency, it must ensure that at least a certain portion of the product must be produced or procured locally. For example, the Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission, also known as JNNSM, launched by Indian government in 2010, requires that 75% of the solar equipment for all supported projects must be made locally. This clause has been incorporated by India to protect the domestic solar industry against imports from China and the US, since both these countries offered cheaper loans to Indian projects to buy their equipment. It is important to note that solar manufacturers in China and US receive substantial state subsidies and loan guarantees from their governments. The next one is buy local legislation. Under this form of trade policy, the government makes its purchase from domestic producers only. This legislation forbids the government's departments to make use of imported goods. However, the government may at times permit the use of imported products only if price is below than that of the domestic producer. This instrument is widely used by developing countries to develop and broaden their manufacturing base. In case of developed countries, this measure aims to protect local jobs and industry from foreign competition. The economic effect of local content requirement and buy local legislation is same as that of quota. It limits foreign competition, thereby benefiting the domestic producers. The restriction on imports raise the price of goods for consumers. The effects of alternate trade policies have been shown in the table. Other non-tariff barriers. The first one being labeling and testing standards. Some countries require that goods entering into their boundaries must meet certain requirements in terms of packaging, labeling and testing standards. Such countries allow sale of only those goods which satisfy these standards. These standards require that companies must indicate on its products the name of the country where it is made, or the packaging of the good must indicate the raw material used in the production. All these requirements add to the production cost of the company. Testing standards require the testing of products coming from foreign countries to be tested in domestic laboratories so as to ensure their quality. Labeling and testing standards are insisted upon for ensuring quality of goods seeking an access to the domestic market, but many countries use them as protection measures. Such measures are complex and discriminatory barriers to international trade. At the same time, they are one of the most difficult ones to control as compared to other barriers to trade. The second one being the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Sanitary and phytosanitary measures are taken to protect against risk linked to food safety, animal health and plant protection, or to prevent or limit damage within the territory of a country from the entry, establishment and spread of pests from a foreign country. The sanitary and phytosanitary agreements under the World Trade Organization seeks to lay down the minimum sanitary and phytosanitary standard that the member countries must achieve for international trade of food products. This is to ensure the safety of life and health of humans, animals and plants. However, countries actually lay down more stringent phytosanitary and sanitary norms. This at times is done to increase the imports coming into the country. Developing countries have for long maintained that these standards can be and are being used as trade barriers against them. This practice has an adverse impact on their exports. The most common complaint is that the standards are set very high and often unreasonably so. It is in fact contended that the standards are strategically kept at high levels so that exports from developing countries can be banned. For example, Indian meat and poultry products faced such standards imposed by European Union and United States. The third one is the specific permission requirements. This measure requires that potential importers or exporters secure permission from government authorities. This involves the issuing of import or export license, which may be costly and time consuming. The next one is the counter trade. The exchange of goods with goods between countries is referred to as counter trade. This practice is common in case of aerospace and defense industry, whereby importer country may have enough foreign currency to pay for the imports. The fifth one is the administrative barriers to trade. Administrative barriers to trade are a special category of non-tariff barriers, and their main sources are administrative regulation and procedures that have a restrictive effect on international trade. These trade barriers can take form of legal barriers or procedural barriers. Legal barriers are caused by different laws and administrative regulation in domestic economies. Procedural barriers are related to trade procedures, and they include all activities, practices and formalities involving international movement of goods. Delays may be made with respect to issue of licenses, customs valuation and clearance of consignment of goods and so on. These type of barriers are most difficult to monitor and eliminate as compared to other tariff and non-tariff barriers. The next one is anti-dumping. Before talking about anti-dumping, one should know what is dumping. Dumping can be defined as selling goods in foreign market at below their fair market value, or selling goods in foreign markets at below their cost of production. It is a way by which companies unload their excess production in foreign markets. It can also be predatory in nature, with producers using substantial profits from the home markets to subsidize prices in foreign markets with a view to drive domestic producers out of that market, and later raising the prices and earning huge profits. If the export price is lower than the normal value, it constitutes dumping. Thus, there are two fundamental parameters used for determination of dumping, namely the normal value and the export price. Normal value. Normal value is the price at which the goods under complaint are sold in the ordinary course of trade in the domestic market of the exporting country. Export price. The export price of goods allegedly dumped into India means the price at which it is exported to India. Next is dumping margin. The margin of dumping is the difference between the normal value and the export price of goods under complaint. It is generally expressed as a percentage of the export price. Now let us see an example. Let us see if there is a good which is having a normal value of $110 per kg, the export price being $100 per kg. There is a dumping in this case, as export price is lower than the normal value, and the dumping margin in this case is $10 per kg, which is 10% of the export price. Dumping is an unfair trade practice when it causes injury to domestic industry of any country, and the anti-dumping policies are formulated to protect domestic producers from unfair foreign competition. Anti-dumping is a measure to rectify the situation arising out of the dumping of goods and its trade distortive effects. Thus, the purpose of anti-dumping duty is to rectify the trade distortive effect of dumping and re-establish fair trade. It provides relief to the domestic industry against the injury caused by dumping. As per the World Trade Organization rules, member nations are allowed to impose anti-dumping duties on foreign goods being sold cheaper in foreign markets than the home market. Anti-dumping duty does not normally exceed the margin of dumping, which is the difference between the sale price in domestic country and export price, which is the price at which the goods are being exported into the foreign country. The Indian law also provides that the anti-dumping duty to be recommended or levied shall not exceed the dumping margins. However, in the following two situations, any exporter or country is to be excluded from the scope of anti-dumping investigation. Individual exporter. Any exporter whose margin of dumping is less than 2% of the export price shall be excluded from the purview of anti-dumping duties, even if the existence of dumping is established. The second one is the country. Further, investigation against any country is required to be eliminated if the volume of the dumped imports, actual or potential, from a particular country accounts for less than 3% of the total imports of the like product. However, in such a case, the cumulative imports of the like product from all these countries who individually account for less than 3% should not exceed 7% of the import of the like product. All the anti-dumping investigations and recommendations in India are carried by designated authority, which is the Ministry of Commerce, whereas the imposition and collection of duties is done by Ministry of Finance. Now let us summarize what we have discussed so far. Free trade is a rare phenomenon. Government makes use of various instruments to interfere in international trade. These instruments are broadly of two types, tariff and non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers refers to the tax imposed by governments on goods that are imported into the country. Non-tariff barriers can have direct influence on price and the quantity of goods being imported. Some of the non-tariff barriers are subsidies, quotas, voluntary export restraints, local content requirements by local legislation. Dumping can be defined as selling goods in foreign market at below their fair market value or selling goods in foreign market at below their cost of production. Anti-dumping is a measure to rectify the situation arising out of dumping of goods and its trade distortive effect. Thank you.